This lecture is part two of a two-part lecture on divinity and ultimate reality. So if you haven't had a chance to watch the first lecture, I recommend going back and starting there because some of the ideas that I discuss in this lecture will build off of some of the concepts I've already introduced in the first lecture. But what we're going to be doing in this lecture is we're going to be looking at some influential ideas about the nature and character of God. We're going to be looking at the question of what does it mean to say that God is a necessary being, and we're going to be looking at the philosopher John Hick to get some categories there for thinking about what God's necessary existence means. Then we're going to be looking at the omnipotence of God, the claim that God is all-powerful. Is that a coherent idea, and if so, how? And then we're going to spend some time looking at what's called the providence of God. So what does it mean to say that God controls all things or brings things about in history? How does God interact with the creation if God exists? And there have been major ideas that have been developed there. Ideas like deism, where God doesn't interact with the created order. And you have other ideas that say God is more involved. And so we're going to be looking at some of those main ideas here for this lecture. But we'll start with John Hick in his contention that when you look at the biblical story, he argues that it teaches that God is ontologically or factually necessary, but not logically necessary. So that's the big idea of the article that you've been reading, where John Hick is the author, is that God is ontologically or factually necessary, but not logically necessary. And it's important that you understand the distinction that Hick is making here. And this distinction really goes back to our lecture on the ontological argument. So if you remember back from that lecture, I gave you what is just the standard ontological argument that was first articulated by Anselm, where he argued that God is the greatest conceivable being, or we could think of this as God being a necessary being, according to Anselm. And if you can conceive of something greater than God, then whatever it is that's greater than God, well, that thing would have to be God. And in our chain of thinking, we can do a thought experiment where you can imagine what things are possible to not exist. And as you do that thought experiment, we've done this many times before, but you can imagine that this room doesn't exist, the world doesn't exist, the universe doesn't exist. Once you start imagining things out of existence, is there anything left? Well, whatever is left, that thing is a necessary being. If it's not, then you can imagine it to not exist. So whatever it is that you can imagine to not exist is a contingent being. But if you get to a point where you can't even imagine the non-existence of a thing, well, that's a necessary being. And according to Hick, God would be factually necessary. God's necessary existence must be a factual or ontological thing. And essentially what he's saying is that in our world of reasoning, God is necessary. God is the being that brings the universe into existence necessarily. But he argues God is not a logically necessary being. So the distinction there is, this goes back to Plantinga's modal ontological argument. We can get some help there understanding what logical necessity might be. And to say that God is logically necessary is to say that God not only is necessary in our actual world, but God is also necessary in any possible world, which is to say that you can't even imagine a scenario where God is not the logical necessary being. And so the big idea in Hick's article is that when theologians talk about God necessarily existing, they should refer to God as being factually necessary and not logically necessary. So that's the distinction that he makes there. In the article that you read by Moses Maimonides, he introduces a concept in theology that's become known as negative theology. And this is just right from the article that you're assigned to read for this week, Maimonides writes, "Know that the description of God by means of negations is the correct description. A description that is not affected by an indulgence in facile language and does not imply any deficiency with respect to God in general or in any particular mode." In other words, what Maimonides is arguing here is that when we talk about God, it is not appropriate. So Maimonides is a Jewish philosopher. He says it's not appropriate for us to ascribe positive attributes to God. That is, we shouldn't say that God is all-loving, because when we do that, we are using human language, which is finite by definition, to describe an infinitely perfect God. And human language cannot adequately describe an infinitely perfect God, and so we shouldn't use human language to describe God. But of course, theologians want to talk about God. And so if we can't use human language to describe the attributes of God, what should we do? Well, Maimonides has a solution, and that is we talk about God by means of negations. In other words, we ascribe negative attributes to God, where we don't say that God is all-powerful. Rather, what we might say is something like, God is not powerless. And so we're not affirming what God is, we're just saying what God is not. So we're not going to say that God is infinite, because he says that to say that God is infinite is to only imagine God in human categories. But what we can say is we can say that God is not finite, or we can say that God is not ignorant. So we don't want to say that God is all-knowable, because again, we're taking our human understanding of knowledge and ascribing that to God. It would be better to say that God is not ignorant, or we would say that God is not inattentive or negligent. And so this is what it means to be doing negative theology. You start saying the things that God is not, because that is, from Maimonides' perspective, more accurate than trying to use human language to describe what God is. Now, of course, there is a problem with this that many have pointed out, and that is, even when you're using negative attributes, aren't you, by definition, also limiting God in some respect? Because to say that God is not powerless, can you even say that if you don't have any understanding of what powerful is? This is one of the critiques that is sometimes issued at Maimonides and other theologians that take this approach. So what are then the attributes of God that we might discuss? Some of the major philosophical attributes that theologians will discuss will be attributes like omnipotence, to say that God is all-powerful, or omniscience, to say that God is all-knowing, or omnibenevolent, to say that God is all-good. We are going to look at the attribute God is omnipotent here, to say that God is all-powerful. And one of the theologians that probably has done the most work at outlining what omnipotence means is Thomas Aquinas. So one of the things that you need to know about Aquinas is he brings Aristotle into Christian theology, probably more so than any other theologian has. And you can contrast that with, say, Augustine, who brought Plato into Christian theology. So you almost see the twin traditions that you have between Plato and Aristotle is similar to the traditions that you have between Augustine and Aquinas. And when you read through Aquinas' work, one of the things that you'll often see is he'll talk about the philosopher. And whenever he refers to the philosopher, he's referring to Aristotle. So you see a lot of Aristotle's influence and Aquinas' thinking. But when Aquinas is thinking about the omnipotence of God, he thinks about questions like this. Can God create a square circle? Now, a question like this for Aquinas is not meant to just be a simple brain teaser. The reason why Aquinas considers questions like this is because it helps us define what it means to say that God is all-powerful. And so Aquinas writes, if we consider the matter aright, since power is said in reference to possible things. So it's important to realize what Aquinas is doing here. He's going to define what it means to say that something has power. And to be powerful, he says it must be said in reference to possible things. And if that's the case, he goes on to say, the phrase, God can do all things, is rightly understood to mean that God can do all things that are possible. So this is important for Aquinas. To say that God is all-powerful is not to say that God can do anything, whether it's possible or impossible. To say that God is all-powerful, according to Aquinas, so this is, a huge idea in, say, Christian theology. To say that God can do all things possible, to say that God can do anything that is logically possible, and for this reason he is said to be omnipotent, that is, all-powerful. Aquinas continues, therefore, everything that does not imply a contradiction in terms is numbered among these possible things in respect to which God is called omnipotent. Whereas, now this is important here, whatever implies contradiction does not come within the scope of divine omnipotence because it cannot have the aspect of possibility. So, what Aquinas is saying here is that when you ask a question like, can God create a square circle, you are asking God to do something that is a contradiction. Because if something is a square, by definition, it's not a circle. And if something is a circle, by definition, it's not a square. So when you're asking God to create a square circle, you're asking God to do something that is logically impossible to do. It's a contradiction. And so he's defining divine omnipotence at this point as meaning God can do whatever does not imply a contradiction. And then he continues, for whatever implies a contradiction cannot be a word, because no intellect can possibly conceive such a thing. In other words, a question like, can God create a square circle, is actually a question, according to Aquinas, that is not a question, because a square circle is not even a word, it's not even a thing. So the question is completely meaningless from Aquinas' perspective, because it's asking God to do something that can't be done. And so this is the key for understanding what omnipotence means in Aquinas' theology. Now we could ask another question that on the surface does not imply a contradiction, and that is the question, well then, can God sin? Now if you think about this question, it's a very different question than asking, can God create a square circle? Because according to Aquinas, and just according to logic, nobody can create a square circle. So if you ask me to create a square circle, it's something that I can't do because square circles are not things. But if you ask me, can I sin? Well, that's something that doesn't seem logically impossible. In fact, most people, if you ask them, have you ever done anything that's wrong before? They would probably say yes. So it's obviously not impossible for people to do sinful things that are wrong, that are immoral. These things happen all the time. So can God do that? Now, the question here is attempting to put the question of God's omnipotence on the horns of a dilemma. Because if you say that God cannot sin, then you're saying that there's something that God cannot do. Well, here's how Aquinas responds to this. Aquinas writes, to sin is to fall short of a perfect action. Hence, to be able to sin is to be able to fall short in action, which is repugnant to omnipotence. Therefore, it is that God cannot sin because of his omnipotence. In other words, Aquinas is building into the definition of the word omnipotence to be perfect, essentially. And to sin is to not be perfect. And so God cannot sin simply because God is omnipotent. And if you say that God can sin, then what you're saying, according to Aquinas, is that God is not omnipotent. And therefore, because of the subject involved in the question, this is also a meaningless question according to Aquinas. Now, if you put the subject as being me, can Mike sin? Well, that's not a meaningless question because I am not omnipotent. Therefore, the question is perfectly reasonable. But once the subject is God, God is the omnipotent one, well, then the question becomes meaningless. Not because of the action itself, but because of the subject who is acting out the action. And in this case, it would be God, and therefore the question is meaningless. Well, there are a whole host of questions like that are meant to try to figure out whether or not this attribute of omnipotence is logically consistent. Another famous question that has been asked many times, in fact, my 7-year-old asked this question when he was 5. He said that he heard this from one of his friends, actually. And the question is, can God create a stone too heavy for him to lift? So again, these aren't meant to just be brain teasers. These questions are meant to figure out whether or not the notion of omnipotence is even a logically coherent idea. And George Maimonides has offered a response to this question that goes like this. He says, the form X is able to draw, say, a square circle, seems plainly to involve a contradiction, while the statement X is able to make a thing too heavy to lift does not. Now, if you ask, well, why is this so? Again, just replace the subject God with Mike. So am I able to create a stone so heavy that I can't lift? Well, the answer seems to be yes. I can create a stone so heavy that I can't lift. I can build many things that are too heavy for me to lift, and so there is no problem here for me to do that. But what Maimonides wants to do, similar to what Aquinas does, is to point out that the key point of this question is to consider the subject, not the action that's being taken. And again, the subject in this case is God. And so Maimonides responds to this question by saying this. The real sentence ought to go this way. A stone which cannot be lifted by him whose power is sufficient for anything to be lifted. In other words, when you ask, can God create a stone too heavy for him to lift? Really, you should be asking, can the one who can lift absolutely everything and create absolutely everything, can the one who can create a stone infinitely large create something too heavy that the one who can lift everything can't lift? And once you structure the sentence that way, Maimonides says you realize that this too is just a meaningless question. There's no content to it, and therefore it doesn't challenge the notion of God being omnipotent. Because again, to say that God is omnipotent in the Aquinas tradition is to say that God can do anything that's logically possible to do. So that's how philosophers and theologians have wrestled with the notion of God being omnipotent. Well, now we're going to turn to a different notion and discuss God's providence. And in this section, you read the philosopher Paul Helm, and he writes this in his article. In Scripture, so Paul Helm is a Christian. He's actually a Calvinist theologian and philosopher. In Scripture, God is said to be one who knows the end from the beginning. All things are naked and open before his eyes. He has numbered the hairs of our heads. He knows our downsizing and uprising, and he ordains all things after the counsel of his will, and so on. And so Helm argues that when theologians, and he's thinking specifically Christian theologians who hold to the inspiration of Scripture, when they talk about God's providence, they have to incorporate all of this into their notion of providence. So what does it mean to say that God is in control of all things? What does it mean to say that all things happen after the counsel of God's will? What does it mean to say that God ordains all things? However you think through those things, it has to be consistent with the fact that God does, in fact, have providential control. Well, we can consider different ways that people have imagined this providential control. So Nicholas Malebranche proposed an idea that today is called occasionalism. So he writes that there is only one true cause of everything that happens because there is only one true God. The nature or power of each thing is nothing but the will of God. And all natural causes are not true causes, but only occasional causes. So what is Malebranche saying here? Essentially what he's saying is that there is only one cause for every effect that happens. So if you look at the moment that's moving across your screen there just a moment ago, and you look at that dotted line represents every moment that happens throughout history. So what's interesting, thinking about just the notion of causation for a moment, things seem to be, on the surface, always changing. Now, there's a big philosophical debate of whether or not things are always changing, but for our purposes, let's just imagine for a moment, or think for a moment, that our appearances of things are actually correct, and we can say that change is actually occurring all the time. So when you started this lecture, there have been a lot of changes that have taken place. You might have received new information that you had before listening to this lecture. Perhaps not, but some of you may have experienced some new information. Now, if you've experienced new information, there's a change that's taken place. You now are more informed than what you were when you started this lecture. So that change has taken place, and so there must be a cause for it. Well, every moment that goes by, we are moving from a state of ignorance to a state of knowledge. We are moving from a state of being young to a state of being old. Changes are always taking place, and so it's important for us to ask, what is bringing about those changes? According to the doctrine of occasionalism, every change that happens is brought about by God. In other words, every moment that happens because of God's causal activity. So everything I'm saying right now, I'm saying because God is bringing about this event right now, this moment right now. God is not just sustaining this event, but God is actually creating almost out of nothing each moment that we are living. And so there is only one cause for every effect that happens. Now you can contrast that with the deist perspective, where according to deism, God's causal activity happens once. So we might say God's causal activity happens at the moment of creation. But then after that, natural law takes over. And so on this view, you have natural law, which is connecting every event to every future event. So you have event A followed by event B, followed by event C. So again, every dot on your screen represents the next moment. Well, each one of those moments are connected by a chain of cause and effect, and that's what we might call natural law within the deist tradition. And so what is natural law? Well, natural law seems to be something like, at bottom, chance and or necessity. So chance would be the state that an object is in, or an event is in, and that state can bring about two different effects. So the best examples to think of, say, within the scientific world would be something like biological mutations. So when a mutation happens, typically biologists talk about things like mutation happens randomly. Like you have a random mutation that happens, and then you have natural selection, which isn't a random thing at all. Random selection is selecting mutations that happen that are beneficial for an organism to fit a particular environment. And so natural selection, you can think of it as being a very choosy thing. It's almost like a necessary thing that happens. Whereas the mutation itself, you could describe that as being a chance event. Now again, philosophers debate about whether or not chance actually has any mode of causation. So we'll save that discussion for another time. But natural law seems to be something that is either chance and necessity working together, or perhaps it's just necessity plus previous events, objects, or moments. And so what this is saying is every dot on your screen that represents a moment also represents an object. So the best way to think about causation here, the best illustration I can think of is just playing pool. Now, when we were in the classroom, we talked about this. So if a cue ball hits the 8 ball, well, the object, we're tempted to say that the object of the cue ball is what caused the 8 ball to move. But that's not technically true, because the cue ball has no causal power in and of itself. This is why the whole issue of causation has been a mystery for philosophers throughout the ages, because every object doesn't seem to have causal powers in and of itself. And so it usually is more correct to say something like the state that the cue ball is in the state that the cue ball is in caused the 8 ball to move. It wasn't the object of the cue ball. It was the object connected with something like natural law. So you could try to write out different laws of physics to explain the motion that's happening there. You calculate the acceleration of the cue ball, and all of that represents natural law. The acceleration of the cue ball, the angle that it's at, the mass of the objects in question. So you have natural law being something like chance and necessity plus previous events, objects, or moments, and that's how a deist thinks of causation. And this is how a deist thinks of God's providence over the world. God gets the world started, but then afterwards, everything that happens in history happens because of natural law. Now, another perspective on this is the perspective of Thomas Aquinas, and he's really going to bring occasionalism and deism together, and he makes a huge deal out of the distinction between the creator and the creation. And this distinction is really a distinction between primary cause versus a secondary cause. And you can find Aquinas' theory of causation in many different aspects of his work, but one that I want to focus on is just his 5 proofs for God's existence. We haven't discussed these specifically in class, but he famously has these 5 proofs for God's existence, what he calls the proof from motion, the proof from efficient cause, the proof from necessary being, the proof from perfection, and the proof from order and direction. And if we look at these 5 proofs, they really can be broken into 3 types of arguments that Aquinas makes. The first 3 are cosmological arguments. The 4th one is a moral argument, or an aesthetic, a beauty argument. And then the 5th one, sort of a teleological argument. But for our purposes, we're going to focus on his cosmological arguments, because cosmological arguments are all about the cause, what caused something to happen. And in Aquinas' theory of causation, every state begins at rest. Now, just a moment ago, we looked at the dots on the screen being every moment throughout history, the history of the universe. Well, let's think about every one of those dots as a series of dominoes falling. In Aquinas' theory of causation, every domino begins at rest, which is to say that every domino on your screen has no ability in and of itself to bring about the effect of that domino falling or any other domino falling in the future. The domino's just at rest. And so one of the big philosophical questions before Aquinas is, how do things get in motion then? If everything begins at rest, how do things get in motion? And Aristotle answered this question by making a distinction between potential and actual. And actually, Aquinas takes up this Aristotelian thinking in his Theology. So if we take this Aristotelian thought and apply it to the dominoes, every domino has the potential of falling, which means it has the potential of movement. But every domino is also, at the same time, actually at rest. And so in the worldview of Aristotle and Aquinas, every object has both potential and actuality in it. But potential has no causal power. So even though every domino can potentially fall, the domino can't get the movement started by its own. And that's why Aquinas argues, as with Aristotle, that there must be a first explanation or a first mover, a first cause, and that cause is one of the proofs for God's existence that Aquinas uses. That first cause must be God. And we can understand this argument with these 4 points. So point number 1, nothing can be the cause of itself. 2, every effect must have a cause. So if you see anything in motion, which is to say that you're seeing an effect, there must be a cause that brought it in motion. Otherwise, it's almost as if things are just popping into existence. So every effect must have a prior cause. 3, causation cannot regress into infinity. 4, therefore there must be a first cause, to which, according to Aquinas, everyone gives this the name God. Now, I bring up this argument to explain again Aquinas' theory of causation, and this really relates to his understanding of providence, God's providence. Aquinas wants to say, with Paul Helm, that God does control all things that happen in history, but God doesn't directly cause everything that happens, as the occasionalist would have to say. So the occasionalist says that God brings every moment into being. Aquinas says, no, there's a distinction between the creator and the creation, which is to say there's a difference between primary causation versus secondary causation. And Aquinas says God is the primary cause of all things that happen, but God also builds into the created order secondary causes. So whether we're talking about people, you and me, we would be secondary causes in the fact that we make choices. So if you think that there's such a thing as free will, which Aquinas thinks there's such a thing as free will, we are truly the cause of some of the actions that we have. We make choices. God is not causing us to choose things, as the occasionalist would have to say. Instead, we make choices that are under God's providential control. The choices are real, even though God is the one that sustains everything that happens in history. Animals, likewise, have causes. The motions of subatomic particles and atoms, they have some causal powers within themselves. Whether it's the objects themselves or the state that the objects are in, there's some causal power there, and the two work together. So this is Aquinas' view of providence, that there is a primary cause and that cause is God, but there are also real secondary causes in the cosmos.